All right, welcome to week two of our class. We made a big leap last week. Some of the important highlights to remember would be, for example, how we got to the need for a performing rights society, right? So ASCAP, BMI, CSAC as the primary American, the primary three American performing rights societies had a story of creation that followed very much along the lines of the French one. You've got a composer that goes to a restaurant and hears their song being played and basically recognizes that he's having to pay extra, right, for the privilege of listening to his own music and sees the injustice in that immediately. Another big thread, of course, also with the French precedent here would be the very first recording device. So you've got Thomas Edison, who is the American counterpart, some 20 years after Leon Scott of Martinville, who has, or Léon de Martinville, practice my French accent, Edouard Léon Edward Scott de Martinville. All right, I'm sure you're probably tired of that by now. But in any case, so you've got the technology kind of leads the way, and then you have some of the business practice that supports that, and then you've got laws as well that regulate these new, the innovations and the business practices, the combination of that, and of course, the flow of income. So we see all of that, as well as some different creators, forms of entertainment that are developing, and how music is making it from the margins to the mainstream. So, we'll be continuing with those threads a little bit. The main threads for the 1940s and 50s. Story that I want to tell here are going to be how, on the technology side, film and audio come together for the first time. So you get rid of the silent films, and now you've got films that have sound and image. A very, very powerful tool, not just for mainstreaming, but even for rescuing art forms from the past, but especially for making individuals that are in the spotlight, having the power to make them very popular. And so it's one of the elements of the creation of the pop icon, the pop music icon, the music star, as we would call it today, even possibly, celebrity status. Film with sound is a big part of that. Another big part is the second thread here, the electric microphone, as it leads to a new style of singing, which doesn't have to be very loud and belting and shouting anymore, but instead you can speak very gently and amplify your voice quite a bit, and it's a totally different approach, of course, to singing into the giant horn. And so there are stars that are associated with that and who use that to create a sense of intimacy with the listener that works very well along the lines of sexual innuendo, right? The intimacy that's created through the whisper singing of crooning did wonders for Bing Crosby's career, and is probably one of the prime contributors to the creation of Frank Sinatra as one of America's early sex symbols, who was, a vocalist, right? Not that surprising, but these are elements in the sort of cocktail or the recipe for the creation of the pop music icon. And then we'll finally get to, the one who was crowned the king of rock and roll, Elvis. I would like to encourage you all to question this, and I will certainly do so myself. It's not a question about the merit of Elvis as a performer, entertainer, as a singer, but rather being critical of the choice of the the establishment gatekeepers of the entertainment industry who would make a king out of this particular individual when what he was doing had been going on already for the better part of a decade. Okay, so those are some of the main sort of threads. When we get to film and, or looking back, I guess now on film and music, the very first film with sound in it was The Jazz Singer in 1927. And when I say rescuing, the combination of film and music has the power to rescue art forms. If you look at that film, this is Jolson is a white guy singer, popular in the time, but it dressed in blackface. So this is, a style of performance that goes back to the minstrelsy. And he's singing plantation songs of Stephen Foster. So this is way out of date, but it made an even bigger star out of Jolson. So despite the fact that the minstrel shows were, 50 years in the rearview mirror, and, other forms of entertainment like vaudeville had replaced the minstrel shows, it's an interesting commentary that, film with sound included in it can sort of reach back and still give power, has the power to sort of make a passing star out of Jolson, a star with a little bit more duration and in my opinion merit. I'm neither here nor there or Jolson, but Cab Calloway. Now you're getting into my wheelhouse. Also sort of an interesting gray area in terms of neither white nor neither one side or the other on the white-black race equation. Calloway was a mulatto, son of a banker, born and raised in New York City, and made his name in music and then in film as well, and actually earlier in film. So you see 2 or 3 titles in the 1930s and 1940s, songs about swing music. And jazz, not songs, but films about jazz music. So he's starring sort of as the lead in a film about, that's kind of autobiographical or is biographical in a sense. And so Cab Calloway having, benefiting from that. And then you've got we talked about that second thread, the development of the electric microphone, Bing Crosby, Frank Sinatra. You see them after the fact in the 1940s in some cartoons. One of the things I do in this class is that, I use cartoons from time to time to recognize that if you have, it's kind of like stand-up comedy. If something is referred to in a cartoon or in a stand-up comedy bit, that's a surefire way to recognize that it is a topic of of society that was recognized at the time when that bit was written. So oftentimes retrospective. I've put this on the Canvas site. So crooning Frank Sinatra. So this is a satire of a style of singing that was associated with Sinatra and Crosby. It goes back to that electric microphone, right? And so basically the narrative, and you can watch this, but you've got these hens on the way to lay their eggs, and then they hear in the distance someone singing in this crazy style, this kind of whisper singing, and then let me put this up a little bit, and then they go, and who do they see? Sure enough, it's not the buff, muscular, right, a hero, sex symbol of the 60s, Beach Boys days, but instead it's this skin and bones rooster who's singing in this case to a can, and all the women are losing it, right? And so it's a great sort of moment in time there, but it gets to the point of where does this idea of pop icon, the charismatic sex symbol, start to come from? It's well in play by the time of the 1940s for sure. Also, you've got the combination of sound and film benefiting the career of the Nicholas brothers, which was a dance duo. Here you go. These are two films that they were in dancing. Sun Valley Serenade in 41, and then 2 years later, Stormy Weather. So Sun Valley Serenade, you've got, this is a Glenn Miller band performance. So Glenn Miller, a swing band, a white swing band, with Tex Beneke there singing. They're there, the Nicholas Brothers. We'll check out a little bit of what they can do. But, you probably wouldn't know about these guys unless you were into jazz dance or tap dancing, but they are, like Gregory Hines, for example. Super fantastic synchronized dancers. And also Stormy Weather. Here you've got Cab Calloway, who, as I mentioned, huge fan. And so he's got more of a black swing band. And keep in mind, music, popular music of this time was really on the cutting edge because you started to have mixed bands. So less a question of a hard black and white, but more a question of, do the musicians know know the material and know their instruments well enough? So having, as we mentioned in the last class, Benny Goodman hiring black guitarist Charlie Christian and then going to Carnegie Hall, that was sort of astounding, for that would be 38. And so popular music as an area where some of the issues of society are sort of negotiated before they ever get to the point of, popular revolt or news stories. For example, this is only 20 years or 15 years after the Tulsa massacre of 1921. So in any case, not to dwell too long on the race issue, but here you've got an interesting image of popular music sort of working across racial boundaries in the favor of art, for the sake of art, and then letting that example shine forth, to the public to do with it what they would. Now, it wasn't always good, in some cases, like the case of Nat King Cole here, born 1917, a contemporary of Frank Sinatra. Nat King Cole had this, his trio, did a lot of solo works in films, had his own TV show, right? So imagine that, 1950s, America well on its way to, increasing tensions on the side of race that are bringing us into the explosions that we see, race riots and, assassinations in the 1960s. America was still, I think, kind of in the state of somewhat acceptance because of the work of the swing bands, which sometimes are on film, sometimes not. More often not. I would say they're consumed by radio and record more. But there was some safe space for racial sort of mixing among the musicians, that is. But that all came to a stop. So you see this television show of his only ran for 2 years. And he did have a radio series before that, some of his accolades. The TV show only lasted for 2 years because by the 1950s, middle of the 50s almost, most of America had already gotten themselves a television. I think they debuted in 48. You've got 51 as the early adopters, making its way down from the upper class to the upper middle class, etc. So his TV show was running at the point when more people than not, I think, were in a position to adopt and get a television. And so he had this unfortunate misstep from the eyes of conservative viewers to, be taking a bow at the end of his show with his co-performer, I think it was Rosemary Clooney, but it was, in any case, a white woman singer. And as they took a bow together, they had, arm around each other, as actors and stage performers often do, going back earlier than Broadway. And that mere, half embrace of taking a bow with his arm around his co-host and vice versa ended up getting his show taken off of the air. So that's a sign of, where we were at that point in time. On the other side of the race coin, you got Sinatra, huge, right, in 1940s. To give you a sign of how big he was, had a show in Columbus, Ohio, in 1944, had 30 at a 3,600 seat venue, over 30,000 fans show up, and then of course there are not enough tickets, and so you've got a riot that breaks out, trying to get into his show. He does have a sort of refined Western European style training background, this bel canto style of singing. Very good technical control, emphasis on the feeling, perfect for crooning, right? So singing into the microphone in a more of a whisper, dulcet tone. So there's some of his background. One of his songs there, Nancy with the Laughing Face, is available for you to check out, but I don't want to get a copyright notice here, so I'm just going to mark that for your reference. Now, as we get to the question of, well, when do we have the sort of convergence of all of these elements of the pop icon? It's in this guy here, right? So West Dallas native, Texas, that is, Aaron T-Bone Walker. Look at the charismatic sort of, the stuff he's got going on here between doing the splits, choreographed big band, you're fronting a big band with an electric guitar, singing his own stuff. So he finally incarnates all of the elements of that would be associated by the time Hendrix gets around here. And this is 20 years before. So, he does this for the first time on record, at least, I think in 41. Early 40s in any case. And so he's got all of these elements together, and then Hendrix, of course, turns it up to 12 as the or 11 as the Spinal Tap reference goes. If you're not familiar with that, you should look it up. It's a great satire of popular music, of rock music. But instead, we don't hear so much about him. Instead, we hear about Elvis. Oh, Elvis is a white guy. All right. So I wrote about this, and I do have my article up on. I had an article published on this topic, and it's on Canvas, called "Race, Hegemony, and the Birth of Rock and Roll." And basically, I'm looking at this idea of hegemony, which is a subtle convergence of a lot of different forces in society. So the way that values are taught at school versus church versus in the media, there seems to be, a subtle agreement of values and the way things are supposed to be. And at the time of the 1950s, those values were, predominantly white. And we'll talk about this in the, it's not as if they hadn't been, white the whole time. I'm not saying that, but to the point of willfully not just ignoring the African American predecessors of rock music that had been coming on since jump blues in the late 1940s, but working to overwrite and erase that. So, like I said, we'll talk about this more in the next sort of looking at the birth of rock and roll. But Elvis, has been attacked by some scholars as an outright thief of African American culture. So cultural appropriation is the term that's used for that. And then there are other more nuanced readings that I tend to endorse, which was that he was born, not in the, upper middle class. His upbringing was very much in step with his context. He was, on the poor side of town, and was learning the sort of culture through music, at least, of that. And it wasn't as if he was only inspired by African American culture. He did cover, African American artists like Arthur Big Boy Crudup, but he also was doing, Blue Moon of Kentucky and stuff when he first went into Sun Records in the early 50s there. And so, it was kind of what he represented I think, not by appropriating, but honestly by his upbringing, that was at once interesting and also threatening to mainstream society. And hasn't it always been that way? So we'll look at rap going mainstream in the 1990s as a a sort of fascination point for young white middle class kids who are sold a version of blackness that is, strictly guns and violence with gangster rap, and they are hook, line, and sinker. They are buying it like hotcakes. And so this sort of fascination with black culture, we can. That's an interesting sort of thread that you can trace that through very easily through the history of popular American popular music. Elvis, I think, is one chapter of that. The thing about him, however, is that when he signed with RCA in the 1950s, so he was with Sun, which is an independent label, allowed to be much more sort of natural to himself. When he signed with RCA, they were very clear about cleaning up his image and would not, his first TV performances, they would not show him dancing on screen because the movement of the hips was just, would make people pass out instantly and, get the vapors and have to be brought back, into consciousness. It was just too overwhelming, all of the sexual energy. I laugh, but I'm actually not joking. And so there are different arguments around him. And so I sort of deal with those and look at, yes, he was crowned, but part of his legacy was also erased and whitewashed and cleaned up. Sort of an interesting figure there. And so, yeah, he was rebranded after 1955 with a much more sort of conservative identity. This picture to the right with him in the bow tie is an actual picture, but it's also a little bit of a stretch. He didn't go through his career, as we all know, with a tuxedo after he was signed to a major label. But we can see, his career as a sort of, looking glass, looking at how independent labels and independent record labels and major labels work in lockstep. So the independents being much more able, a little bit more cutting edge and able to take chances and have artists that are a little bit edgier. And then the majors will sit back and kind of watch and see if that, do they kind of, do they have staying power? Do they rise to the top? How does their image sort of, is it very marketable? How much work needs to be done? And then they'll pounce if after they observe these artists in the hands of the independent labels. So anyway, those are some of the interesting threads here of the 1940s and 50s. We'll get into, this is just an introduction video. We'll get into more of the regular PowerPoints here shortly. Thanks for joining us.